Even after 2 decades in law enforcement, there were still some scenes that could shake me to my core. Standing outside a house on Mallory Crescent in Toronto, I watched with horror as forensic teams unearthed decaying, dismembered human remains. I tried to maintain my composure, but the sight was overwhelming. My mind flashed back to a fellow detective's words. "The worst part of this job is how you eventually get used to it. When I first took this case, I expected it to be like any other missing person investigation I had handled in the past. I couldn't have imagined it would lead me to uncovering one of the most dangerous serial killers in Toronto's history." It all started in the Church and Wellesley neighborhood, a well-known area in Toronto often called the Gay Village. The village, with its lively cafes, bars, and eateries, had been regarded as one of the safest parts of the city and a haven for Toronto's LGBTQ community. But in 2010, that sense of security shattered as residents of the neighborhood started disappearing mysteriously. On September 6, 2010, a 40-year-old man named Skandar Navaratnam left his home and was never seen again. He was reported missing a few days later, on September 10, 2010. Toronto Police Services launched an investigation, trying to reconstruct his last movements and trace his whereabouts. But despite all their efforts, it seemed Navaratnam had simply vanished without a trace. As time passed, things only worsened. 2 more men, Majed Kaihan and Abdul Basir Faizi, also disappeared from the Church and Wellesley area. Faizi, a 42-year-old, was last seen on December 28, 2010, shortly after Christmas, and was reported missing the following day. Detectives added him to the active missing person case that had already included Navaratnam, but with little to no progress, the investigation seemed to stall. Detectives know that time is crucial in missing person cases. The first 72 hours often hold the key to finding a missing person, or at least a clue that can point investigators in the right direction. But when those initial hours pass without any leads, the chances of finding the person alive begin to diminish. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into years, with no sign of either Navaratnam or Faizi. Hopes dwindled among both the police and the families, and many began to fear the worst. By the time 2 years had passed, the case felt almost hopeless. While some still clung to the rare stories of missing persons who returned years later, detectives knew these instances were exceptionally rare. The tension in the Church and Wellesley neighborhood was at an all-time high. People were demanding answers that authorities just didn't have. In the midst of this growing chaos, yet another man, Majed Kaihan, disappeared on October 18, 2012. The pattern of vanishings in Church and Wellesley was both alarming and baffling for the authorities. They still had no leads on the first 2 men who went missing, and now a third had vanished without a trace. For a community with little history of such disturbing events, the mystery surrounding the disappearances was hard to comprehend. 3 men were now missing, and despite exhaustive efforts, the police were no closer to solving the case. Little did they know, however, that the situation was about to become even more grim. Over the next few years, more residents of Church and Wellesley would go missing. This haunting trend continued on August 12, 2015, when 50-year-old Sorosh Mahmoudi disappeared. The Toronto police barely had time to begin their investigation into Mahmoudi's case before another person, 37-year-old Karushna Kumar Kanagaratnam, was reported missing later that same month. With 2 more residents gone, detectives worked tirelessly to find traces of the victims or their captor, but no evidence seemed to surface. Whoever was behind these abductions was skilled, leaving authorities frustrated and at a loss. Given the repeated disappearances, the investigative team anticipated that the perpetrator might strike again the following month. All units remained on high alert, bracing themselves for another case. But as the weeks went by, they began to realize that their assumptions were incorrect. No one else went missing the next month or in the months that followed, leading detectives to suspect that the abductor was lying low to avoid detection. For a time, there was a lull in the disappearances, and it seemed like the nightmare might be over. But the calm was short-lived. On April 21, 2016, 43-year-old Dean Lisowick vanished, reigniting fears across Toronto. The following year, 2017, would see two more disappearances. The first took place on March 20th, when 44-year-old Selim Eason was last seen. Then, on June 26th, 49-year-old Andrew Kinsman also went missing. By this point, both the Toronto police and the city's officials were deeply disturbed. What had begun as a seemingly isolated missing persons case had escalated into a nationwide search for a suspected serial killer. For residents of Church and Wellesley, the neighborhood that had once felt like a sanctuary was now shadowed by fear. Initially, authorities had referred to the suspect as a kidnapper to help ease community fears. But by now, both residents and detectives knew that they were dealing with a serial killer. With mounting pressure from the public, the Toronto Police Service intensified its efforts, forming specialized task forces devoted to capturing the killer. Investigators retraced the victim's last steps, interviewed numerous witnesses, and initiated new forensic procedures. The operation quickly expanded in scale, with the Toronto Police calling on the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, and the Ontario Provincial Police, OPP, for additional support. As resources poured in, the case grew to become one of the most extensive criminal investigations Toronto had ever undertaken. The complexity of the operation continued to escalate, with more forensic and investigative agencies joining the search for answers. Soon after, I received a call from Chief Saunders, the head of the Toronto Police Service, asking for my help in tracking down the person responsible. I still remember walking into Chief Saunders' office that Monday morning, seeing the weight of the case etched onto his face. He looked worn, clearly burdened by the unending nightmare that had gripped the city. After inviting my partner and me to sit, he met my gaze and said, "Good morning, Detective Matthew Stone and Junior Detective Emily Scott. I have to admit, getting a hold of you both hasn't been easy." I chuckled and replied, "Well, Chief, we're only human, and we try to handle one case at a time." Chief Saunders studied me briefly before responding. "I'm sure you're aware, Detective, that this one is unlike anything we've ever faced." "You're already familiar with the chaos this case has stirred up," Chief Saunders began. "We've got the entire Ontario Provincial Police and Royal Canadian Mounted Police on board, but the complexity of this case is holding back any real progress. Other officers and detectives keep telling me you've earned the nickname the Bloodhound. If anyone can solve this, they say it's you. I've reviewed your record myself, and it's impressive, to say the least. That's why I brought you and Detective Scott in, to bring your expertise to help this city finally find some peace." I'd always had mixed feelings about that nickname, the Bloodhound. It had been pinned on me back at the academy, but it made me feel more like a predator than a detective. When I asked why my colleagues called me that, they'd say it was because once I caught a scent, I'd chase it down no matter where it led. While that was true, the name made me uncomfortable, and fighting it had only made it stick harder. So I learned to live with it. I thanked Chief Saunders for his trust in me and my partner. "I appreciate your confidence, Chief, but I'll be honest. I'm no better than any other detective out there working hard on this case. Still, my partner and I will give everything we've got to identify the person behind these attacks on the Church and Wellesley neighborhood." Chief Saunders chuckled, giving me a firm look. "No need for modesty, Detective Stone. I know you're among the best, and I'm counting on you to help us solve this mystery." With that, Detective Scott and I took our leave and headed to meet the lead Canadian detectives on the case. After a few hours, we had been thoroughly briefed and were ready to get to work. The moment I reviewed the files, I saw why this case had remained unsolved for over 7 years. Chief Saunders had been right about the complexity. The details were as tangled as they were disturbing. One of the most challenging aspects was the similar lifestyles of many of the victims. The records indicated that they frequently used dating apps, a factor that created significant challenges for investigators trying to trace their last known contacts. Since these apps often connect strangers, it was difficult to piece together who these men might have met before they vanished. The detectives had tried to track down and interview a few of the people the victims had connected with on these apps, but those efforts led nowhere. Many dating app servers were based outside Canada, and getting judicial authorization to access data was an uphill battle. The more I dug into the case, the more I understood why progress had been so slow. I knew I'd have to approach this investigation from a different angle and start by identifying any patterns. Detectives are trained to spot patterns that might reveal connections in cases, and this one had a few telling markers. First, there were striking physical similarities among the victims. They were middle-aged men, most with beards or some form of facial hair. 6 of the 8 victims shared an ethnic background, Middle Eastern or South Asian. This wasn't a coincidence. The perpetrator clearly had a type. To me, this pointed away from a theory that some detectives had proposed: hate crimes. This didn't seem random or driven by prejudice. Based on the patterns, it appeared that the killer was choosing these victims because of a personal preference. Everything pointed to a single, terrifying conclusion: the killer was likely targeting these men due to his own attraction. Since many of the missing men were either openly gay or leading secretive lives to conceal their sexuality, it seemed likely they had been enticed with the promise of an intimate encounter. The serial killer probably preyed upon this vulnerability, convincing the victims to go along with them under the guise of a good time. Another pattern that stood out to me was that many of these men disappeared around holiday weekends. The most recent case, Mr. Kinsman, vanished just after Toronto's Pride celebration. Before him, Mr. Essen had disappeared over Easter. This pattern continued with earlier victims. Mr. Navaratnam disappeared on Labor Day, Mr. Khan during Thanksgiving, and Mr. Faizi right after Christmas. Most of the victims had strong social lives and were well connected within the church and Wellesley community. They frequented a well-known local bar called the Black Eagle, a popular spot for the LGBTQ+ community. Trying to track down leads from the bar's patrons would have been futile. It was a busy venue with countless visitors. So I decided to follow the freshest clues and headed to Andrew Kinsman's apartment. The Toronto police had already scoured Kinsman's home, looking for evidence of struggle or anything that could provide clues to his last moments, but they'd found nothing significant. I knew I needed to take a fresh perspective. Arriving at Kinsman's apartment that afternoon, I examined every detail, remembering that in cases like these, it's often something small and seemingly unimportant that breaks it open. A leftover dinner, a TV show, even a to-do list could be the key. After hours of combing through the apartment, my eyes fell upon a calendar on Kinsman's wall. It was filled with daily notes, mostly minor appointments and reminders, but one entry for June 26, 2017, caught my attention. That date, the day Kinsman vanished, had a single name written on it: Bruce. Finally, after 7 long years of investigations, we had a lead. With a name to go on, I immediately obtained the surveillance footage from June 26th. Reviewing it, I saw Kinsman entering a red minivan. The footage was grainy, so I couldn't make out the license plate or clearly identify the driver, but I recognized the vehicle as a 2004 Dodge Caravan. I contacted Emily to pull records on all Dodge Caravans in the Church and Wellesley area and the broader Toronto region. She soon reported there were over 6,000 similar models registered. Narrowing it down, I asked how many were registered under the name Bruce. Only 5 matches came up. My final question to Emily was to identify if any of these 5 were 2004 models. After a brief pause, she replied that only one of the 5 was a 2004 Dodge Caravan, owned by a man named Bruce MacArthur. MacArthur's full name was Thomas Donald Bruce MacArthur, and as we dug deeper into his background, disturbing details emerged. He was a well-known landscaper in the Church and Wellesley area and had a reputation within the LGBTQ+ community for engaging in rough encounters and BDSM. His records indicated he'd been banned from the Church and Wellesley neighborhood years prior, in 2003, due to violent altercations and aggressive behavior at local bars. Bruce MacArthur's name first surfaced in this investigation years ago. During the initial inquiries in 2013, he had been questioned by Toronto police after the disappearances of Mr. Navaratnam and Mr. Khan. Authorities had received an anonymous tip that MacArthur was romantically involved with Navaratnam and had been seen on multiple occasions with Khan. On November 11, 2013, during his interview, MacArthur denied any romantic relationship with Navaratnam and stated that he had employed Khan in his landscaping business, Artistic Designs, which explained their interactions. With no solid evidence linking him to the disappearances, the authorities dismissed him as a primary suspect at the time. Though our only evidence against MacArthur was Kinsman's calendar, I was confident he was responsible. So, I traced the movements of his red minivan on June 26, 2017, through street surveillance. It led me to MacArthur's apartment building, but the minivan was no longer there. After further investigation, I discovered that MacArthur had sold the vehicle. It took our entire team to locate it, but we eventually tracked the van down to Dom's Auto Parts in Courtice, Ontario. On October 3, 2017, my partner and I, along with other detectives, visited Dom's Auto Parts, where we approached the owner, Mr. Dominique Vitti. Discreetly, we informed him we were looking for a red 2004 Dodge Caravan. Mr. Vitti told us the vehicle had indeed been sold to him on September 16, 2017, by Bruce MacArthur, and it was still intact. We immediately took the van in for forensic examination, which revealed blood traces inside, particularly around the trunk. The samples were sent for analysis, and forensic results confirmed the blood belonged to Andrew Kinsman. With this hard evidence, we placed MacArthur under surveillance, carefully observing his daily routines. Finally, on January 18, 2018, when authorities saw an unidentified man enter MacArthur's apartment, presumed to be his next victim, they moved in and made the arrest. The man, John, was secretly gay and had met MacArthur on a dating app, Growler, one of MacArthur's preferred platforms to lure victims. Following MacArthur's arrest, police searched his apartment and seized all electronic devices. They discovered numerous graphic images of Mr. Essen and Mr. Kinsman's bodies, kept as macabre souvenirs. Although MacArthur had attempted to delete the files, computer forensics recovered them. DNA analysis of additional blood traces in the van also linked to Mr. Essen. With this overwhelming evidence, we charged MacArthur with 2 counts of first-degree murder. But a crucial question remained. Where were the victims' bodies? The Toronto police and other agencies searched multiple properties associated with MacArthur's landscaping business, but initially found no remains. One property, however, caught my attention: the Mallory Crescent residence. The owners were longtime clients of MacArthur's, and I had a strong intuition that he may have hidden something there. When my partner Emily and I arrived, we examined the property meticulously. After hours of searching, we found nothing. Just as I began to doubt, Emily suggested we think like MacArthur, a landscaper who would likely hide remains in places he could camouflage, garden beds or flower boxes. Acting on Emily's insight, we focused on the plant beds around the property. We soon found large planter boxes in a nearby ravine. The boxes had been frozen into the ground, indicating they had been there for a long time. When forensic investigators arrived with cadaver dogs, the dogs fixated on the planter boxes. The boxes were transported to the coroner's office, where they were thoroughly examined, and horrific discoveries followed: skeletal remains and decomposing body parts of MacArthur's victims. With these findings, the mystery that haunted Toronto's Church and Wellesley neighborhood was finally solved. MacArthur had exploited his landscaping jobs to conceal his victims' remains in planter boxes and flower beds across the properties he serviced. The remains of all 8 victims were eventually recovered, bringing closure to the missing persons cases that had spanned 7 years. On January 29, 2019, Bruce MacArthur pleaded guilty to 8 counts of first-degree murder. In court, he admitted to luring, assaulting, killing, and dismembering the men, even attempting to delete incriminating evidence. His confession spared the need for a lengthy trial, and on February 8, 2019, Justice John McMahon sentenced him to life in prison. Following MacArthur's sentencing, the Toronto police chief personally thanked our team for our dedication to the case. As my partner Emily and I left Toronto, heading to our next assignment, I reflected on the bittersweet outcome. Though we couldn't save any lives, we had at least brought justice to the victims and peace to their families. The case of Bruce MacArthur remains one of Canada's most harrowing true crime stories. His crimes, which terrorized Toronto's Church and Wellesley neighborhood from 2010 to 2017, made him one of the country's most notorious serial killers. At 72, MacArthur is now serving a life sentence at Millhaven Institution, a maximum security prison.